Eli felt the ground beneath his feet begin to crack, and realized with horror that something huge was awakening in the dark depths of the forest. The shadows around them began to move as if alive, and the air was filled with an ominous whisper that was not quite a sound, but rather a sensation that penetrated his very soul. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out, as if his voice had been swallowed up by this bottomless darkness. Suddenly, an unimaginably cold hand, covered with dark, sticky sparks, burst from a crack in the ground and grabbed his wrist, causing him to feel a searing pain. He looked down, and in the dark mirror of the crack was not his hand, but the wild, curved paw of a wolf with golden eyes full of ruthless power. Chapter 1. The Unexpected Encounter. The woods outside of Evergreen were familiar to Eli. He had spent countless hours wandering through them, learning their secrets like an old friend. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, the crunch of twigs beneath his boots, everything felt like home. At 15, Eli already knew more about these woods than most people in town. He could name the trees, the plants, and even some of the animals. But on this particular evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he stumbled upon something that would change his life forever. Eli had been walking alone that day, enjoying the silence, when he noticed something strange. A faint whimper reached his ears, carried by the wind. His curiosity piqued. He followed the sound deeper into the forest. The sun had already begun to set, casting long shadows through the trees, but Eli wasn't afraid. He had always felt at home here, as if the woods themselves were his companions. The whimpering grew louder, and soon Eli found himself at the edge of a small clearing. There, lying in the dirt, was a creature he hadn't expected. A wolf pup, no older than a few months, its fur matted with dirt and blood. Its eyes were wide with fear, and it whimpered again, trying to move but clearly in pain. Eli's heart raced, and without thinking, he rushed to the animal's side. The wolf pup flinched when Eli knelt down, but it didn't try to run. The pup's leg was caught in a snare, a cruel trap set by hunters to catch animals. Eli gently placed his hand on the pup's head, speaking softly, trying to calm it down. He could feel its tiny body tremble beneath his touch. The wound was bad, but not fatal if treated quickly. The animal's deep brown eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, Eli knew what he had to do. "Hang on, little guy," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "I'll help you." Eli had never treated an injury this severe before, but he wasn't about to leave the creature to suffer. He carefully examined the snare, trying to figure out how to release it without causing the pup more pain. His hands worked quickly but gently, the urgency of the situation making his heart race. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the snare came loose. The pup immediately tried to pull away, but it was too weak to move far. Eli scooped it into his arms, cradling the fragile creature against his chest. Its fur was rough and wild, but Eli could feel its small heart racing as it pressed against him, still in shock. The boy had never been one to show fear, but now, as he looked at the wounded animal, something deep inside him stirred, a sense of responsibility, of something far greater than he had ever known. "I'm not leaving you here," Eli said firmly, though he wasn't entirely sure who he was trying to convince, himself or the pup. "I'll take care of you." Eli turned and began to walk back toward his cabin, the pup still clutched in his arms. His house was a good distance away, and the walk would be long, but he couldn't just leave it there to die alone. As he made his way through the woods, the last of the sunlight faded, leaving only the soft glow of twilight. The forest felt different now, as if it were watching him. Eli wasn't afraid, but there was a sense of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. What would his parents say when they found out? What if the authorities found out? Wolves weren't exactly welcome in the small town of Evergreen. Eli tried not to think about it. For now, he was focused on the pup, on getting it home, on keeping it alive. By the time he reached his cabin, it was nearly dark. The house was quiet, as it always was when his parents weren't home. They were out at the community center for the evening, and Eli had the place to himself. He hurried inside, making his way to the kitchen where the first aid supplies were kept. He had no idea how to treat a wolf pup, but he wasn't going to give up on it. He gently laid the pup on the kitchen floor and grabbed a towel to dry its fur. The pup let out a soft growl as Eli tried to clean its wounds, but it didn't fight. Eli was careful, taking his time, aware that one wrong move could make things worse. As he worked, his mind raced. What was he going to do? He couldn't keep a wild animal in the house forever. It wasn't safe for either of them. But he couldn't bring himself to just leave it in the woods either. The pup was dependent on him now, and he felt a deep connection to it, a bond that went beyond logic or reason. He wrapped the pup's leg in a bandage and settled it in a blanket by the fireplace, hoping the warmth would help it recover. The wolf pup's eyes were closed, but it still whimpered softly in its sleep. Eli sat beside it for a while, staring into the fire as the crackling flames filled the room with light and warmth. His thoughts were clouded, torn between the growing affection he felt for the pup and the fear of what might come next. When his parents returned home late that evening, Eli's heart skipped a beat. His mother walked into the kitchen first, looking at the blanket by the fire with surprise. "Eli, what's that?" she asked, her voice cautious but curious. She had always been the more practical one, the one who knew how to handle situations, but Eli could tell she was unsure of what she was seeing. Eli stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. It's a wolf pup," he said quietly, avoiding her gaze. His mother raised an eyebrow, and for a moment, there was silence. "What do you mean, a wolf pup?" she asked, her tone a mix of disbelief and concern. "I found it in the woods," Eli explained quickly, rushing to fill in the gaps. "It was trapped in a snare. I couldn't just leave it there, so I brought it back to take care of it." His mother let out a heavy sigh, stepping closer to inspect the pup. Her eyes softened as she examined the tiny creature lying in the blanket, its fur now dry and its breathing steady. "You can't just keep a wild animal here, Eli," she said, her voice more gentle than before. "It's dangerous. For both of you." Eli nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He knew she was right. He had always known that a wolf had no place in a human home. But he couldn't bring himself to turn his back on the pup. Not now, not after everything it had been through. "I'll figure something out," Eli said quietly, though he wasn't sure what that something was yet. He didn't know how, but somehow, he felt like the pup was meant to be with him. There was a connection, something that went beyond logic or reason. For now though, he would take it one day at a time. Chapter 2. The Little Companion. The next few days were filled with a quiet, tense routine. Eli spent most of his time in the cabin, keeping the wolf pup close. He had named it Shadow, a fitting name for the way the little creature followed him everywhere. It wasn't just the pup that had changed Eli's life. The woods had started to feel different, too. He had always walked through them with a sense of belonging, but now, they seemed to be closing in on him, as though watching his every move. The trees whispered secrets he didn't understand, and the sound of his own footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence. Shadow had started to recover quickly. The bandages on his leg were replaced every day, and the pup's once feeble whimpers had transformed into eager, playful barks. It wasn't long before Eli noticed how attached the pup had become to him. Every time Eli moved around the cabin, Shadow would follow, his small paws clicking against the wooden floors, his brown eyes always fixed on the boy. It was almost as if the pup had chosen him, not just for protection, but for companionship. Eli had never had many friends. There were a few kids his age in Evergreen, but none he felt particularly close to. Most of them didn't understand him or his love for the woods. They were more interested in video games and the latest trends, while Eli preferred the company of birds, trees, and the occasional stray cat that wandered by. Shadow, however, seemed to understand him in a way no one else did. The little wolf was quiet, observant, and, despite his wild nature, loyal. Eli wasn't sure why, but Shadow's presence made him feel less alone. One crisp morning, after a heavy rainstorm that had washed the woods clean, Eli decided to take Shadow out for a walk. He had been careful not to let anyone know about the pup, even though it was becoming harder to keep it a secret. His parents had gone back to work, leaving Eli alone in the cabin for the day. He couldn't stay cooped up inside any longer, and Shadow, who had grown noticeably stronger, was itching for an adventure. "Come on, boy," Eli said, grabbing a small leash that had once belonged to his old dog, a spaniel that had passed away a year ago. He attached it to Shadow's collar, though he knew it was more symbolic than anything. The pup wasn't about to be tamed that easily. The moment they stepped outside, the world felt new again. The air smelled of wet earth, and the trees had a fresh vibrancy to them. Shadow trotted beside him, sniffing the ground and wagging his tail. Eli kept a watchful eye on him as they walked, half expecting the pup to take off and run wild through the woods at any moment. But Shadow stayed close, as if he knew he was still healing, still dependent on Eli. For now, he was content to explore at a slower pace. Eli led the way into the deeper parts of the forest, where the trees were thicker and the sunlight barely touched the ground. This was his favorite place, the place where he could truly feel alone with his thoughts. It was also the place where he had first found Shadow. It felt like a quiet sanctuary, and now, with the pup by his side, it felt even more like home. As they ventured farther, Shadow seemed to grow bolder. He stopped every few steps to sniff the air, his nose twitching as he picked up new scents. When they reached a small stream, Shadow paused, looking at Eli expectantly. "You thirsty?" Eli asked with a smile, crouching down beside the water. Shadow lowered his head and lapped at the stream, drinking deeply. Eli watched him, feeling a strange sense of pride. He had saved this pup, nursed him back to health, and now they were walking together through the very woods that had brought them together. But as they sat by the stream, something in the distance caught Eli's eye, a flicker of movement among the trees. It was too fast, too brief, for him to make out what it was, but it was enough to send a chill through his spine. He stood up, instinctively placing himself between the strange movement and Shadow. He strained his eyes, trying to make sense of it, but there was nothing. Just the wind rustling through the branches. "Probably just a deer," Eli muttered, more to reassure himself than to explain it to Shadow. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had spent enough time in these woods to know when something was out of place, and this felt wrong. He turned back to Shadow, who was still drinking from the stream, oblivious to Eli's unease. The pup's simple innocence gave Eli a brief sense of comfort, but the tension in his gut remained. What was it about these woods now that felt different? He couldn't place it, but he had a nagging feeling that the woods weren't just a home to him anymore. They were watching him, just as they had watched him when he first found Shadow. "Let's go back," Eli said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Shadow or to himself. He needed to clear his head, and he needed to make sure that whatever that was in the trees wasn't following them. As they made their way back through the forest, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The wind whispered through the branches, but this time, it felt like more than just nature's breath. It felt like a warning. Shadow, as if sensing his unease, stayed close to his side, glancing around as though he, too, had heard something. When they reached the cabin, Eli locked the door behind them, taking a deep breath as he let the calm of home wash over him. Shadow padded over to his bed, curling up with a soft grunt. But Eli couldn't relax. He stood by the window, staring out into the darkening woods, trying to convince himself that he was being paranoid. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The woods were hiding something. The question was, what? Chapter 3. The Hidden Threat. Eli couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in his chest. The woods had always been his sanctuary, his escape from the noise of the world. But now, it felt as though they were closing in on him. The rustling of the leaves, the howls of distant coyotes, the creaking of the branches, they all sounded different. Darker. More foreboding. The next morning, after a restless night spent tossing and turning, Eli decided to go back to the forest. He needed to know what he had seen, or what he thought he had seen, in the shadows. Shadow, who had slept soundly beside him through the night, was up and about as soon as the sun's light filtered through the curtains. His tail wagged energetically as he nudged Eli's hand with his nose, eager to get out. Eli grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The crisp morning air filled his lungs, and for a brief moment, he let the cool breeze calm his nerves. The woods still looked the same, the the sunlight breaking through the canopy in beautiful beams. But something had shifted in the atmosphere, and Eli wasn't sure if he could ever see them the same way again. "Come on, Shadow," Eli muttered, more to himself than the pup, and set off toward the woods once again. The morning was peaceful at first, with the soft sounds of birds chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Shadow trotted along beside him, occasionally sniffing the ground or chasing after a butterfly. Eli tried to push his unsettling thoughts to the back of his mind, but they lingered like a storm on the horizon. He couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was out of place, that something was watching him. As they walked deeper into the woods, Eli felt the air grow heavier, the woods becoming more dense. The trees were older here, their trunks gnarled and thick with age. It was the part of the forest where he had first found Shadow, the place that had always felt the most alive, the most untouched by human hands. But now, it felt too quiet. Even Shadow, usually full of energy, had grown still. The little wolf's ears perked up at every sound, his body tense and alert. Suddenly, Shadow let out a low growl, his hackles rising. Eli froze in his tracks. The sound of the growl seemed to cut through the silence like a blade. Eli turned to look at the pup, whose eyes were wide and focused on something in the distance. "Shadows," Eli whispered, his voice barely audible. The pup didn't respond, his gaze fixed ahead, and Eli followed his line of sight. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, there was movement. Eli squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, he thought it was a deer, but as it stepped into the light, his heart skipped a beat. It was a man, a tall figure dressed in dark clothes, moving silently through the woods. His presence seemed unnatural, like a shadow among shadows. Eli's breath caught in his throat as he instinctively took a step back, pulling Shadow closer to him. The man moved with a purpose, not stopping, not looking around. His eyes, even from a distance, seemed cold and calculating, scanning the woods with an unsettling intensity. There was something predatory in his movements, and the way he blended with the forest made Eli's blood run cold. Eli's mind raced. Who was this man? What was he doing in the woods? The forest wasn't exactly a popular spot for hikers or tourists, especially this deep into it. The hairs on the back of Eli's neck stood up as he realized that he was no longer alone. And neither was Shadow. Shadow barked once, breaking the silence. The man's head whipped toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. The moment their gazes met, Eli felt a jolt of fear shoot through him. The man's expression was unreadable, but his stare was like ice. "Shadow, come on," Eli whispered urgently, grabbing the pup's collar and tugging him back. He didn't want to stay out here any longer. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, watching them, his figure blending back into the forest like a shadow. Eli took a few more steps back, but his foot caught on a root, sending him tumbling to the ground. He cursed under his breath, hoping the man hadn't noticed. But when he looked up, the man was gone. As if he had never been there at all. The woods had swallowed him whole. Shadow's growls subsided, but the tension in the air remained. Eli stood up quickly, brushing the dirt off his jeans. His heart was pounding in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. What had just happened? Who was that man? And why did he feel like they were being hunted? "I don't like this, Shadow," Eli said, more to himself than to the pup. "Let's get back home." They made their way back to the cabin as quickly as they could, the woods now feeling oppressive, the trees pressing in around them. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves, seemed to be a reminder that they weren't alone. Eli's mind raced with questions. Had he imagined the whole thing? Was the man really there? Or had the fear he felt in the moment played tricks on him? When they reached the cabin, Eli locked the door behind them, feeling a brief sense of relief. The cabin, with its worn wooden floors and familiar smells, felt like a sanctuary compared to the dark, mysterious woods outside. Shadow padded over to his bed, curling up with a soft whimper. Eli couldn't bring himself to sit. His nerves were too raw, too jangled. He paced the floor, thinking over everything that had happened. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't the only threat lurking in the woods. There was something else out there, something he hadn't seen, but could feel, deep in his bones. A presence that watched him, followed him, and was waiting for the right moment to make itself known. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cabin, Eli stared out the window, looking into the woods that were now more mystery than ever before. He wasn't sure what was out there, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever it wasn't going to stop. And neither would he. Not until he figured out what the woods were hiding. Chapter 4. The Silent Watcher. The next few days felt like a blur to Eli. The events in the woods had left an unsettling mark on him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. He couldn't stop thinking about the man he had seen, or thought he had seen, and the way he had watched them. He had tried to convince himself that it had been a figment of his imagination, a trick of the mind. But the look in the man's eyes, the coldness of his stare, wouldn't leave him. It haunted him, every time he closed his eyes. Shadow, too, seemed more on edge. The pup had always been curious, eager to explore, but now he seemed to be on constant alert. He would stop in his tracks in the middle of the woods, his ears flicking at every sound, his nose twitching as though he could sense something Eli couldn't. It wasn't normal for a pup to be so wary. Shadow's behavior only confirmed Eli's worst fear. Something was out there. And it wasn't just the man. It was something in the forest itself, something that was watching, waiting. Eli couldn't bring himself to go back into the woods for a while. He stayed close to the cabin, only venturing out when absolutely necessary. He worked on small projects around the house, repairing the roof, chopping wood, but his mind was always elsewhere, lingering on the mysteries of the forest. The man. The strange sensation that something was always watching them. The sense that he wasn't as alone as he thought. One morning, a week after the encounter, Eli decided he had to know more. He had to go back into the woods and figure out what was really happening. Shadow seemed to sense his determination, his energy shifting from anxious to alert. The pup bounced around excitedly, wagging his tail as Eli gathered his things. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to get to the bottom of this. They set off, the air crisp with the early morning chill. The woods were quiet, more still than usual. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they walked deeper into the trees, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, made his heart race. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the man standing just beyond the trees, watching them. But there was nothing. Shadow, for his part, was more vigilant than ever. The pup kept his head low, nose to the ground, as though scenting the air for danger. His movements were more deliberate now, no longer the carefree exploration they had shared in the past. Shadow was on guard. They reached the clearing where Eli had found the pup, the spot where the man had been standing that fateful day. Eli paused, scanning the area. The trees were thick here, the underbrush dense. It was easy to get lost, and the shadows seemed to stretch on longer than they should, even though the sun was high in the sky. "That's where I saw him," Eli murmured to himself, stepping into the clearing. "Right over there." Shadow whined softly, his ears flattening against his head. He didn't want to go further. Eli could feel it, the same discomfort in the air, the same oppressive weight that had been gnawing at him for days. But he couldn't stop now. He had to know what was going on. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the silence, a crack of a branch snapping underfoot. Shadow froze, his hackles rising as he growled low in his throat. Eli's breath caught in his chest. He whirled around, eyes darting from tree to tree. The forest was still. Too still. There was nothing there. Nothing except the thick, curling fog that seemed to have gathered around the trees. "Who's there?" Eli called out, his voice more trembling than he meant it to be. His heart was hammering in his chest, the adrenaline surging through his veins. But there was no answer. Just the wind. Just the trees. Shadow barked, his body tense, and Eli's pulse quickened. He could feel it now. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was wrong. Something was closing in. He took a cautious step forward, scanning the clearing, but there was still no sign of anyone. The woods were silent again, but the silence felt unnatural, like something was being held back, waiting to break free. Another snap of a branch echoed through the trees, but this time it came from behind him. Eli whipped around, and there, emerging from the shadows, was a figure, a man, tall and wearing dark, tattered clothes. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but Eli could see the glint of his eyes, cold and calculating. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching Eli and Shadow with that same unnerving intensity. Eli's heart pounded in his chest. The woods seemed to press in on him from all sides. Shadow growled again, his body rigid, but Eli didn't know if the pup could do anything against this stranger. "What do you want?" Eli asked, his voice a little steadier now, though still laced with fear. "Why are you following us?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Eli. He moved like a shadow among shadows, his footsteps silent against the forest floor. Eli's pulse raced. He didn't know if he should run, fight, or something else entirely. But he knew one thing. This wasn't just some random person in the woods. There was something about him. Something dangerous. "Leave us alone," Eli said, stepping backward, pulling Shadow along with him. "We don't want any trouble." The man's lips twitched, though it wasn't a smile. It was something colder. "It's not up to you," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You've already made your choice." Eli's breath hitched. What did he mean? What choice? And then it hit him. This man, this presence, had been in the woods long before he had found Shadow. He wasn't just a stranger. He was something more, a part of the woods themselves, something that had been waiting for Eli to stumble into its domain. Without warning, the man turned and walked into the trees, disappearing just as quickly as he had come. Eli stood there, frozen, watching the spot where he had been, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Shadow, too, was still, his eyes fixed on the trees, waiting for any sign of movement. What was that?" Eli whispered, his voice trembling. "Who was that?" The woods seemed to swallow up the question, the air heavy with the sense that something was not right. Eli didn't know who the man was or what he wanted, but one thing was clear. The forest was not a place for him and Shadow to be alone anymore. Something in the woods was shifting, and it was only a matter of time before the full truth came to light. But Eli wasn't sure if he was ready to uncover it. As the day drew on, the shadows in the forest grew longer, and the answer seemed more distant than ever. Chapter 5. The Hidden Path. Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn deeper into something far bigger than himself. Every moment since the encounter with the man in the woods had been clouded by uncertainty, and the woods, once familiar and comforting, had turned into a labyrinth of secrets and unseen threats. Each rustle in the trees, each creak of a branch, made his heart race. But it wasn't just fear that lingered. It was a creeping sense of destiny, as though he and Shadow were meant to be here, in the middle of it all. After that day in the clearing, Eli had promised himself that he wouldn't go back into the woods. But Shadow didn't share his hesitation. The pup was restless, pacing around the cabin, whimpering as if he were waiting for something, or someone. He would nudge at the door, glance at Eli with pleading eyes, and tug at the leash whenever they were outside. It was as though Shadow, too, sensed that they were missing something, a crucial piece of the puzzle. Despite his growing dread, Eli finally gave in. He couldn't deny Shadow's urgency. If anything, the pup's instincts were sharper than his own, and he trusted Shadow more than he trusted anything else in this strange, foreboding place. They needed answers. One morning, after a restless night, Eli decided to venture back into the woods. He couldn't avoid it anymore. Something was pulling him back, and he couldn't ignore the feeling that the woods, and the strange figure that stalked them, were part of his journey now. Shadow's ears perked up the moment Eli grabbed the old leather strap he used as a leash, and without a second thought, they set off. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled of damp earth. The forest seemed thicker today, the trees pressing in on them with a heavier weight. It felt as though something was watching them. The silence broken only by the distant call of birds and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The deeper they ventured, the more distant the world outside the forest felt. It was as though time slowed, as if the forest had a way of holding on to people and moments, never letting them go. Shadow trotted ahead, his tail high and ears alert, as if he knew something was about to happen. Eli couldn't explain it, but he felt it too. The air felt charged, as if the woods were about to reveal something. After what seemed like hours of walking, they reached the clearing once again, the very place where Eli had first encountered the strange man. The sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. The ground was uneven, with patches of soft moss and jagged rocks scattered across the floor. Eli looked around, half expecting the man to appear from the shadows, but there was nothing. The place was eerily quiet. Eli felt his heart race. The forest didn't feel like it was empty. It felt like it was waiting for something to happen. Shadow's behavior was the first indication that something was different. The pup suddenly stopped in his tracks and started sniffing the ground, his nose twitching as if he had caught the scent of something familiar. Shadow's tail stood straight up, and his ears flicked back. His posture was tense, as though he was about to spring into action. Eli stepped closer, glancing at Shadow in confusion. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. But the pup didn't answer. Instead, Shadow let out a low growl, a sound that was deep and menacing. Eli's skin prickled with unease. Just then, a rustling sound broke the silence. A sound that came not from the trees, but from beneath the ground. It was faint at first, like the scuffling of leaves being stirred by the wind, but then it grew louder, more insistent, as if something, or someone, was digging through the earth just below them. Eli's breath hitched. His eyes scanned the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, just as suddenly as the sound had started, it stopped. The silence returned, but it was the kind of silence that was heavy, suffocating. He took a cautious step forward. "Shadow!" Eli called softly, but the pup didn't answer. Shadow was already moving toward the center of the clearing, his body tense and ready for something. Without thinking, Eli followed him. The ground beneath their feet felt uneven, almost like the earth itself was shifting. He could sense the presence of something ancient and old, beneath the surface. It was as if the land was hiding a secret, one that was slowly being uncovered. Shadow paused at a large gnarled tree stump in the middle of the clearing. His body was rigid, his eyes fixed on the base of the stump as if it were the most important thing in the world. Eli knelt beside him, brushing aside some of the overgrown moss. There, barely visible beneath the thick layer of dirt and leaves, was a set of stones arranged in a tight circle. The stones were rough-hewn, ancient-looking, and they radiated a strange, almost magnetic energy. Eli's fingers brushed the stones, and he felt a jolt of something, an electric charge running through him. "What is this?" Eli whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He stared at the stones, feeling the weight of their history pressing down on him. It was as though they were calling out to him, urging him to understand. Just then, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A low, rumbling sound echoed from beneath the earth, causing the stones to shift slightly. Eli's eyes widened in shock as a small crack appeared in the earth, right where the stones were arranged. From the crack, a faint, glowing light began to seep through. "What the hell?" Eli whispered, his voice trembling. Before he could pull away, Shadow suddenly leapt forward, barking furiously. Eli barely had time to react as the crack in the ground widened. Something was coming up from beneath, something ancient, something that had been buried for far too long. A figure, cloaked in shadow and mystery, emerged from the crack in the earth. The figure was tall and indistinct, with a dark silhouette that seemed to shift and change with the light. Eli's heart thudded in his chest as the figure stepped forward, moving like a ghost from another time. The air grew thick, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. The figure was the same one Eli had seen before, the man who had been watching them, the one who had spoken in riddles. "You've awakened it," the man said, his voice low and rasping. "And now you must face the consequences." Eli's blood ran cold. Shadow growled, his body tense as he moved to stand between Eli and the figure. The man's cold gaze flicked to the pup, and then back to Eli. "It was always meant to be you," the man continued. "You've disturbed the balance. And now, there is no going back." Eli stood frozen, his mind racing, his thoughts scattered. He had only come for answers, but he had opened a door to something far more dangerous. The forest wasn't just a place to hide. It was a place of power, a place that had been hiding something for centuries. And now, it seemed that Eli and Shadow were part of whatever this was. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Eli's. "You'll understand soon enough. The forest never forgets." Chapter 6. The Price of Knowledge. Eli's heart thundered in his chest as the man's words echoed in his mind. The forest never forgets. What did that even mean? And what had he and Shadow stumbled into? The figure before him was no ordinary person. He radiated an ancient, otherworldly energy, something that felt as old as the trees themselves. The way he moved, the way he spoke, it all felt like a warning. And now, the weight of the forest's secrets was pressing down on Eli in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Shadow was still growling, his body tense and ready for action. The pup stood firm between Eli and the man, his eyes narrowed and ears back, not backing down. But Eli couldn't shake the sense that Shadow was scared, too. The woods were no longer a place of comfort for them. The very air around them seemed charged with danger, and Eli wasn't sure how long they could remain in this strange, unsettling standoff. "What do you mean by the price of knowledge?" Eli finally managed to choke out, his voice hoarse. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the cryptic words the man had spoken. The stranger's cold eyes flicked to Shadow, then back to Eli. His lips twisted into a half-smile, one that sent a shiver down Eli's spine. "You've seen too much already," the man said, his voice deep, like the rumble of thunder in the distance. "The forest has been watching you. You and the pup. Ever since you found him, it's been drawing you closer, pulling you towards something you can't escape." Eli's breath caught in his throat. Had the woods really been watching them this whole time? He remembered the odd sensations, the feeling of being followed, even when he was sure no one was around. It had all felt like some bad dream, a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. And now, with a stranger standing before him, that nightmare was beginning to take form. "The pup," Eli whispered. "Shadow." The man's smile faded, his face growing somber. "He's not just a wolf," the stranger said quietly. "He's the key. The forest chose him. Chose both of you. That's why you found him that day. And now you can't turn back." Eli felt a cold knot twist in his stomach. Shadow wasn't just an ordinary wolf pup. He was something more, something tied to the ancient, hidden forces of the woods. But why? And what did it all mean for them now? "Why me?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might make the reality of it all more unbearable. The stranger took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving Eli. "You were chosen because you were willing to see," he said, his voice grave. "The forest doesn't reveal its secrets to just anyone. But you've always been different. You've always known that something lay just beyond what the world shows. You and Shadow are part of a much larger story, one that has been unfolding long before you were born." Eli shook his head, the weight of the words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had always felt something strange about the woods, an unexplainable pull, a need to be there, to understand. But he never imagined it was leading to something like this. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Eli demanded. "Why keep all of this a secret?" The stranger's expression darkened. "There are things that are not meant to be known until the time is right. And you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "have reached that time. The price of knowledge is never easy. And you are already paying it. Eli's pulse quickened. What was the price? What did the man mean? And what was going to happen to them now that they knew too much? The stranger seemed to read his thoughts, his lips curling into a grim smile. You'll learn soon enough. The forest has a way of teaching its own. But be warned, Eli. The man's eyes were cold, like ice. Not all knowledge is meant to be understood. With those chilling words, the stranger turned and began walking away, disappearing into the dense forest as though he were just another shadow among shadows. Eli's legs felt like lead, his mind still struggling to process everything the man had said. Shadow stood still, his eyes following the figure's retreating form with a mixture of caution and confusion. Eli couldn't move. He felt paralyzed, trapped in a web of mysteries he hadn't asked for. He had come to these woods for solitude, for peace, but now he was caught in something far more dangerous. Something that was beyond his understanding. Shadow, Eli whispered, turning to the pup. What's happening? The pup let out a soft whine, his body still tense. Shadow's eyes were full of confusion and unease. He could sense the growing danger, just as Eli could. The wind began to pick up, causing the trees to creak and sway ominously. The soft rustling of the leaves was the only sound now, a quiet whisper in the otherwise heavy silence. Let's get out of here, Eli said, the need to leave the clearing pressing down on him. It felt wrong now, this place where he had first found Shadow, where they had shared their bond. The forest that had once been a home felt like a prison now, one that was closing in around them. They turned to leave, but as they walked back toward the path they had come, something felt different. The woods were more silent than before, the air heavier, as if every step they took was being watched. Eli couldn't shake the sense that they were being followed, even though when he looked over his shoulder, there was nothing. They made their way back toward the cabin, but the sense of unease stayed with them, hanging over them like a cloud. The woods didn't feel like a safe haven anymore. It felt like a maze, one that was pulling them deeper into its secrets. Secrets that Eli wasn't sure he wanted to know. When they finally reached the cabin, Eli locked the door behind him and sat down on the edge of the bed. Shadow padded over to him, curling up at his feet with a soft sigh. The pup's presence was a small comfort in the face of everything that had happened, but Eli couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something far bigger. And whether they liked it or not, the forest had drawn them into its story. Eli stared out the window into the darkening woods, the trees now bathed in an eerie twilight. The forest had a secret, and Eli and Shadow were part of it. But what that secret was, and what it would cost them to uncover it, remained to be seen. As the night grew deeper and the shadows stretched longer, Eli couldn't help but wonder, was the price of knowledge one that he was truly willing to pay? And if he wasn't, could he walk away from the forest at all? The answers, it seemed, were waiting for him. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The days blurred together after the stranger's warning. Eli couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly. His thoughts were consumed by what the man had said. The forest had chosen him. Shadow wasn't just a wolf pup. They weren't just a boy and a dog in the woods anymore. They were something else. Something part of the forest's ancient, hidden story. But what did that mean? What was he supposed to do with that knowledge? Shadow seemed to sense Eli's turmoil. The pup was unusually calm, even affectionate, curling up beside him when they were inside and following him like a shadow wherever he went outside. It was as though Shadow was trying to keep Eli grounded, though Eli wasn't sure if he could even keep himself grounded in the face of what had happened. The forest felt different, colder, as though it had closed its grip around him and Shadow and wasn't letting go. One morning, several days after their encounter with the stranger, Eli couldn't stand it any longer. The weight of the mystery was too heavy. He needed answers. Answers that could help him understand why the forest had chosen him. He needed to confront whatever this was head-on, even if he didn't know how to do it. "Let's go, boy," Eli muttered, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. Shadow perked up immediately, tail wagging. He too seemed restless, as though he was waiting for something. The air was damp as they stepped outside, the earth beneath their feet soft from recent rain. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy and thick, and the forest looked even more imposing than usual. The trees seemed to loom overhead, their branches thick and tangled like the threads of some ancient web. Eli tried to push down the creeping fear, but it gnawed at him. What if they were being watched? What if something else was waiting for them? Shadow led the way as usual, his sharp nose sniffing the air, his ears flicking at every sound. Eli followed close behind, trying to keep his mind from wandering into the dark corners where fear took root. He had to stay focused. He had to find out what was happening before it was too late. They reached the clearing again, and this time, Eli didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. The stranger had told him that the forest had been watching him and Shadow ever since the pup had arrived. The answer had to be here, somewhere, in the heart of the woods. They circled the clearing, Eli scanning the area for any sign of the man or anything else unusual. The stones were still there, half buried in the earth, glowing faintly where the light touched them. Eli knelt beside them again, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. The strange energy was still there, like a hum just beneath his skin. But what did it all mean? Why were they drawn to these stones? What was he supposed to do now? Shadow stopped suddenly, his body stiff. Eli straightened up, following the pup's gaze. He hadn't noticed it before, but there, at the far end of the clearing, was a narrow path, almost invisible, hidden behind thick brush and tangled vines. It wasn't a natural path. The undergrowth had been deliberately cleared, and the soil was disturbed, as though something or someone had passed through it recently. Eli's stomach twisted. He knew that path. It led deeper into the woods, toward a place he had never been. But it was more than that. It felt like it was calling to him, like the forest was drawing him in, urging him to follow. And somehow, he knew he couldn't turn back now. "Come on, Shadow," Eli whispered, taking a deep breath and stepping toward the path. The pup hesitated for only a moment before trotting ahead, his tail low, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Together, they entered the narrow, shadowy passage. The path twisted and turned, winding through the trees in ways that made Eli feel disoriented, like the forest itself was reshaping around them. The light dimmed as they moved deeper, the canopy above thickening, blocking out what little sunlight managed to filter through. The air grew cooler, heavier, as if the world outside was growing distant and forgotten. Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them again, but this time it wasn't the stranger. This time, it was the forest itself, an ancient living thing that was aware of their every movement. They reached a small clearing after what felt like an eternity of walking. The ground here was uneven, with patches of jagged rock and twisted roots jutting out of the earth. But what caught Eli's attention was what lay at the center of the clearing. A large stone altar sat there, half covered in moss and lichen, its surface worn and weathered by centuries of time. Eli felt the air shift as he approached it, a strange pulse of energy seeming to emanate from the stone, as though it were alive. Shadow stepped up beside him, growling low under his breath, his ears flattened in warning. "What is this place?" Eli whispered, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He reached out a hand to touch the stone. The instant his fingers made contact, the world around him seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches creaking ominously. Eli pulled his hand back, startled by the sudden change. That's when he saw it. At the far side of the altar, hidden beneath the moss, was a carving, a symbol etched deep into the stone. It was a complex design, twisted and spiraling in ways that made Eli's head ache just trying to comprehend it. He couldn't understand the markings, but they felt important. They felt like a key, an answer to everything. Suddenly, Shadow lunged forward, barking furiously, his hackles raised. Eli spun around, his heart racing as he saw what the pup was reacting to. At the edge of the clearing, emerging from the trees, was the stranger. But this time, he wasn't alone. Two other figures stood with him, tall, gaunt men, their faces hidden behind dark hoods. Their presence was suffocating, their eyes gleaming with a cold, predatory intensity. Eli's stomach churned as he realized they were the ones who had been waiting for him. The ones who had been watching him and Shadow from the beginning. The man who had spoken to them earlier stepped forward, his voice colder than before. "You found it," he said, his eyes flicking to the stone altar. "And now, you understand the price of your knowledge." Eli felt his throat tighten as he tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The figures around him, no, the forest itself, seemed to close in on him, as though the truth was just out of reach, but it was a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. "The forest is older than you can imagine," the stranger continued, his voice low, almost a growl. "And its secrets come at a cost. You and the wolf have awakened something ancient, something that has been waiting for centuries." Eli's breath caught in his throat. The altar. The symbol. The truth behind the forest was right there, staring him in the face. But was he prepared to learn what it truly meant? The man smiled grimly, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "It's too late now, Eli. The forest never forgets. And now, neither will you." And with that, the forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening, as if the very trees were tightening their grip. The price of knowledge had come, and it was going to change everything. Chapter 8. The Choice. Eli's pulse raced, his heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat. Shadow was still growling, his body coiled with tension, but there was no mistaking the danger that surrounded them now. The three strangers, these gaunt, hooded figures, stood as though they were part of the very shadows themselves. Their presence was like a thick fog, suffocating and oppressive, each one exuding a power Eli couldn't quite comprehend. The man, the one who had first spoken to Eli, moved toward the stone altar with a slow, deliberate stride, his eyes never leaving Eli. The other two figures remained silent, standing like sentinels at the edge of the clearing, their eyes hidden beneath their hoods. The air around them seemed charged, as though something ancient and terrible was stirring beneath the surface. "The forest is older than any of us," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "Its secrets are not meant for mortals to know, but you," he paused, his gaze flicking over to Shadow, then back to Eli. "You were chosen. The bond between you and the wolf. It's not something you can undo. You have awakened something far greater than you understand." Eli felt his throat tighten. The words were too much to take in, too much to process. How could this be happening? How had a simple discovery in the woods led to this? He had only wanted to care for Shadow, to protect him from the world. And now, somehow, they were caught in the middle of something far darker, something beyond their control. "Why are you here?" Eli asked, his voice shaking with fear and confusion. "What do you want from us?" The man stopped before the altar, his fingers tracing the carved symbol on the stone. His lips curled into a small, knowing smile, but there was no warmth in it, only cold, calculating malice. "You already know the answer," he said. "The forest never forgets. And now, neither will you. You've been marked, Eli. You've been chosen by the woods. And you will pay the price for that choice." Shadow let out a low, guttural growl, his teeth bared. The pup was tense, on the edge of snapping, but Eli held out a hand, urging him to stay calm. He could feel the shift in the air, the weight of something dangerous, something that didn't belong in this world. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. "I don't want any part of this," Eli said, his voice firm despite the knot of fear in his stomach. "I just want to go home. I just want to live my life. This isn't what I asked for." The stranger's eyes darkened. "That's the thing about the forest," he said, his voice sharp like a blade. "It doesn't care what you want. It doesn't care about your life, your plans, your dreams. It takes what it needs, and it gives nothing in return." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But you have something it needs now. Both of you do." Eli's eyes darted to the symbol on the altar, the strange, twisting carving that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The more he looked at it, the more he felt it pulling at him, like it was calling him forward, urging him to understand. But he wasn't sure if he could bear the truth. What was it asking of him? And what did Shadow have to do with it? Shadow, Eli whispered, looking down at the pup, who was now standing at his side, ears flat against his head, every muscle tensed. Shadow whined softly, his eyes flicking nervously between Eli and the strangers. You think you can protect him, the stranger said, his voice dripping with disdain. But the forest has already claimed him. And you, Eli. You are tied to him in ways you can't even begin to comprehend. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Eli's stomach turned, but he refused to let the fear overtake him. He had to do something. He had to take control of the situation before it spiraled further out of his grasp. No, Eli said, more firmly this time. I won't let you take him. I won't let you use him. His voice cracked with emotion, his protectiveness for Shadow flooding to the surface. He couldn't allow this man, or anyone, to control their fate. Not like this. The stranger tilted his head slightly, studying Eli with a mixture of amusement and contempt. You have no say in the matter, he said quietly. This is bigger than you, bigger than the pup. You've both been part of this world from the moment you crossed into the forest. And now, the choice has been made. The man turned toward the other two figures, who had been silent up until now. One of them stepped forward, removing their hood to reveal a face that seemed to be carved from stone. Hard, sharp features with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through Eli. Take him, the second figure said, his voice low and commanding. The wolf has to be brought to the heart of the forest. It's the only way. Eli's blood ran cold. No, he shouted, instinctively stepping back, pulling Shadow closer to him. His mind raced, heart pounding in his chest. They wanted to take Shadow to the heart of the forest. But what did that mean? And why? You can't do this. Eli pleaded, desperate now. You can't just take him. He's not yours. The man who had spoken first stepped forward again, his expression impassive. You don't understand. The forest needs balance. The wolf is the keeper of the forest's power. Without him, the woods will wither and die. Without him, the price will be far worse than you could imagine. Eli swallowed hard, his throat tight with fear. The idea of losing Shadow, of having him ripped away from him, was unthinkable. But the more the man spoke, the more Eli realized something darker was at play here. The forest wasn't just alive, it was a force that couldn't be ignored, that couldn't be stopped. What's the price? Eli demanded, his voice shaking but defiant. What happens if you take him? What happens to me? To the forest? The stranger's eyes glinted coldly. You'll see, he said softly. But you may not survive the answer. And with that, everything seemed to shift. The wind picked up, swirling through the trees like a hurricane. The ground beneath Eli's feet trembled, the very earth shaking as if the forest was alive, awakening from a deep, slumbering state. Shadow whined softly, his body trembling beside Eli. He could feel the force of it, the weight of the forest's power pressing down on them, threatening to crush them both. The choice had come. And now Eli had to decide. Would he let Shadow go, sacrifice him to the forest to keep it alive? Or would he defy the ancient forces at play, knowing that doing so could cost him everything? The forest was waiting for an answer. Eli closed his eyes, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. Chapter 9. The Tipping Point. Eli's mind was a storm of confusion and fear. His thoughts were tangled, each one more desperate than the last, but they all led to the same place, Shadow. He couldn't lose him. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through together. And yet, everything the stranger had said, the words about balance, about power, about the forest's ancient demands, made it clear that their lives were no longer theirs to control. The air crackled with tension, as if the forest itself was waiting for Eli to make his decision. Shadow whimpered softly, his eyes wide and uncertain, sensing the gravity of the situation. The bond between them was undeniable, deeper than anything Eli had ever experienced before. He had raised Shadow from a wounded pup, fed him, cared for him, and watched him grow. He was his protector, his companion, and the thought of losing him felt like a piece of Eli's soul being ripped away. But what if the forest was right? What if it really needed Shadow to survive? The very idea made Eli's stomach churn. He had no way of knowing if the stranger was telling the truth or manipulating him. Was there some greater purpose that he didn't understand? "I can't do this," Eli said, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't give him up." The man's face remained stoic, unbothered by Eli's resistance. "You don't have a choice, Eli. You never did." Eli's chest tightened. He took a step back, instinctively pulling Shadow closer, but the pup remained still, his ears flat against his head, his body rigid as though sensing something dark approaching. "Tell me what you want," Eli said, his voice growing more forceful, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions. "Tell me what's really happening here. Why does the forest need him? What is it that you want me to do?" The stranger's eyes gleamed, as though he had been waiting for Eli to finally ask the question. He stepped forward, his long cloak sweeping the ground like a shadow. "The heart of the forest is dying," he said quietly. "It's been slowly decaying for centuries. It's the nature of the land. The magic, the power that sustains this place, is fading. That power is tied to the wolf, to his kind. The wolf is the keeper of the ancient balance, the bridge between the forest's life force and the world around it. Without him, the forest will wither, and with it, the land will fall into chaos." Eli's eyes widened in disbelief. "What are you saying? You want to sacrifice him to save this place?" The stranger nodded, but his expression softened for the first time. There was a trace of something almost sad in his eyes, something that looked like genuine sorrow. "The choice isn't as simple as that. The wolf, Shadow, is tied to this land. His life feeds the forest. His death will either restore the forest's balance or cause it to decay further. There's no middle ground. The forest is old, Eli. Older than anything you could imagine." Eli's mind reeled. He could feel the weight of the man's words, and a sickening feeling settled in his stomach. But something in the stranger's voice, the sadness, the desperation, made Eli wonder if there was more to this than just a sacrifice. "What happens to me? If I let you take him, if I give him up, what will become of me?" Eli asked, the question pressing against his chest like a vice. The stranger's face hardened again. "You'll forget. You'll live your life as if nothing happened. The forest's magic will seep into you, and you'll forget the bond you had with the wolf. It will all seem like a dream, a forgotten memory. And you'll be safe." The finality of the words hit Eli like a punch to the gut. Safe. But what would that really mean? He couldn't imagine a life without Shadow, without the bond they shared. And if he forgot everything, if the forest's magic erased the past, what would he even be? Would he be a stranger to himself? "No," Eli whispered, shaking his head as the tears welled up. "I can't forget him. I can't forget what we've shared. I can't." "You don't have a choice," the stranger interrupted, his voice growing harsh again. "The forest is the one that chooses. It's always been this way." The words hit Eli like a slap, and for a moment, he felt as if he were drowning in them. The pain of the impossible decision pressed on him from all sides. Shadow was his world. But this forest, this power, was ancient, and there was nothing Eli could do to change its course. And then, as if something inside him finally snapped into place, he realized what he had to do. It wasn't about sacrificing Shadow for the forest. It wasn't about being forced into a corner by powers beyond his control. No, Eli knew what he had to do. He had to make his own choice. He couldn't let the forest dictate his life. He couldn't let it take what mattered most to him. "Then I won't choose," Eli said, his voice growing steady, determined. "I won't let you take him." The stranger's eyes narrowed. "You think you can fight it? You think you can defy the forest?" He chuckled, but the sound was cold, devoid of humor. "You'll regret this." But Eli was already moving. He grabbed Shadow, pulling him close. The pup trembled in his arms, but there was something fierce in his eyes. Something that made Eli believe that they could fight this together. The stranger stepped forward, his hands raised as if to strike. But before he could reach them, the ground beneath their feet trembled violently, as though the earth itself had awoken in fury. The trees around them groaned, their branches twisting and cracking. The clearing seemed to expand, stretch, as if the entire forest was reshaping itself in response to the tension in the air. The wind howled, and shadows darted between the trunks, twisting into strange, unnatural shapes. Suddenly, a piercing howl echoed from the depths of the woods, a sound so raw and primal it sent chills down Eli's spine. Shadow froze in his arms, his ears pricked, his eyes wide. It was the sound of something ancient, something that called to him. It wasn't a call for sacrifice, it was a call for survival. And for the first time, Eli understood. The forest wasn't just trying to claim Shadow, it was warning him. "No," Eli said, his voice trembling but resolute. "We're not leaving. We're not giving him up." With that, the ground beneath them cracked open, revealing a deep, glowing fissure, a rift in the earth that seemed to pulse with the same energy as the symbol on the altar. The stranger stepped back, his face pale, and for the first time, Eli saw fear in his eyes. "This is it," the stranger said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The forest has chosen. But so have you." And as the rift grew wider, swallowing the light, Eli realized the forest was no longer just a place. It was a force. And it wasn't going to let them go. The choice had been made, but now, it was Eli's turn to decide if they would survive it. Chapter 10. The Breaking Point. The ground beneath Eli's feet groaned as the rift widened, a deep, pulsing glow emanating from the crack in the earth. Shadow whimpered in his arms, his small body trembling, eyes fixed on the terrifying light that seemed to beckon them forward. The air felt thick with something ancient, a power that neither of them could fully comprehend. But the message was clear. The forest wasn't just watching anymore. It was demanding. Eli's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get as far away as possible from the rift, from the strangers, from everything. But the choice wasn't just about escaping. It was about whether to face what the forest had become, and whether to save Shadow, or to lose him forever. "I won't let you take him," Eli said through gritted teeth, his grip tightening on Shadow. The wolf pup's fur was damp with sweat, his tiny body rigid with fear, but there was something else in his eyes, a knowing, a shared understanding of the gravity of the moment. The stranger, the man who had been so certain, so unyielding, stepped back, his face pale. There was something in his expression now that almost looked like disbelief. "The forest," the stranger murmured, his voice cracking. "It's never reacted like this. The rift, it's not just a symbol of the forest's hunger. It's alive. And it's answering your refusal." Eli's eyes snapped toward the growing rift. It seemed to pulse, the light within it flickering like an unholy heartbeat. The winds around them picked up, swirling violently, sending leaves and debris flying in every direction. The trees, the very ground, seemed to moan in protest. "We're not giving him up," Eli repeated, his voice now firm, unshakable. "You may think you control the forest, but this is our choice. Mine and Shadow's." The stranger's face twisted in something between frustration and fear. "You don't understand. You think you can defy this, but it's not just some force you can ignore. You're playing with fire, Eli. And when the forest burns, so will you." Eli didn't respond. He couldn't. He couldn't let the fear of what might happen to him stop him from doing what was right. He looked down at Shadow, his fur ruffled in the wind, his eyes wide but full of determination. Shadow had been with him every step of the way. He was more than just a wolf, more than just a creature in need of protection. He was family. Suddenly, the rift seemed to tremble with a violent force, as if the forest was testing him. Eli could feel the ground beneath him shift, and then the air grew colder, impossibly cold. A voice, a whisper barely heard, came from the crack in the earth, a voice that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the forest. "You will choose, Eli." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand. It was a promise. The forest was offering him a final choice. Stay, and let it take Shadow, or leave, and take the consequences of defying the ancient power. Eli's knees nearly buckled from the weight of the moment. The decision wasn't simple, wasn't clear. It wasn't just about saving Shadow anymore. It was about the fate of everything. The forest, the land, and him. What will happen to him? Eli whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The stranger's voice was low and gravelly. You can't stop it, Eli. The forest will claim what is rightfully its own. There are forces beyond your comprehension at play here. The bond between you and the wolf is unnatural, meant to be severed. This is the only way. No, Eli said, shaking his head vehemently, his voice catching in his throat. He's not yours. He's not the forest's. He's mine. But the stranger didn't reply. Instead, he stepped back, his gaze shifting to the rift. The other two figures had remained silent, unmoving, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. They were nothing but silent witnesses to the battle that was unfolding before them. Then, to Eli's shock, the stranger lowered his head. You've made your choice, Eli. But don't think for a moment there won't be a cost. Before Eli could respond, the forest around them seemed to shift. The very trees seemed to bend, as though they were alive, as if the land itself were pushing against him. The air turned thick, suffocating, as if the atmosphere was closing in. Shadow growled softly in Eli's arms, his fur bristling as if something unseen were closing in around them. Eli took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He could feel the weight of the world on him, but it didn't matter. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. Suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked wide open, sending Eli stumbling backward, almost losing his footing. Shadow yelped as he squirmed in Eli's arms. The rift seemed to open further, and from it, something else began to emerge. A shadowy figure, tall and imposing, with eyes that gleamed like molten gold. The figure wasn't human. It wasn't anything Eli could have imagined. The creature's form shimmered with an ethereal light, and as it stepped forward, the forest itself seemed to bend and twist around it. You've made the wrong choice, the figure's voice boomed. It was a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the forest, a voice that felt ancient. But it is too late. The balance cannot be restored. You've defied the forest's will. Eli held Shadow tightly against him, instinctively stepping back, but the figure's gaze was too powerful. He could feel the weight of its eyes, the pull of something older and far stronger than anything he had ever encountered. You don't have to do this, Eli said, his voice shaking, but determined. I won't give him up. We've made it this far together. He's my choice. The figure's eyes narrowed, and with a sudden terrifying speed, it reached forward, its long dark hands closing around Eli's wrist. There was no time to react, only a sharp searing pain that shot through his body. His heart raced as if it would explode from his chest, and the world around him began to blur. And then, in that moment, something inside Eli shifted. He closed his eyes, focusing all his energy on the one thing that mattered, Shadow. The wolf was his, and he would protect him no matter what. There was no greater force, no higher power, that could tear them apart. Shadow! Eli shouted, his voice echoing in the darkness. In that instant, the bond they shared flared into life. A raw, powerful connection that surged through Eli's veins, lighting him from within. The pain in his wrist vanished, replaced by a flood of strength. Shadow's energy pulsed through him, and Eli realized what had been awakened, what had been there all along. It wasn't just about the forest. It was about the heart of their bond, their unwavering connection that could not be broken. With a cry that echoed through the very soul of the forest, Eli felt the pull of the earth, the power of the rift, and everything that had stood against them shatter. The shadowy figure froze, its golden eyes wide in shock, as the rift in the earth closed. The air cleared, the suffocating weight lifting as if a great storm had passed. The trees stood tall once again, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. And in that moment, everything shifted. The forest was no longer an enemy. It was a witness. It was part of their story. And for the first time, Eli realized, no force, no ancient power, could break the bond between him and Shadow. Not the forest, not the strangers, and not the world itself. They were free. But the cost of their freedom would be one they would never forget.